My name is Claire. I'm 36 years old, and I've spent the last decade of my life as a registered nurse. A few weeks ago, I sat at my stepsister's wedding reception in a quiet corner, wearing a plain blue dress, hoping no one would bother me. But then my stepsister stood up in front of everyone, pointed straight at me, and said something I will never forget. She laughed as she said it. She told the groom's family that I was nobody special, just a nurse. A few people at the table laughed along with her. I didn't react. I didn't say a single word. I just folded my hands in my lap and kept a steady smile on my face. But then, from across the table, the groom's father slowly set down his fork. He tilted his head. His eyes narrowed just slightly as he stared at me, as though something buried deep inside his memory was beginning to surface. And then his mouth opened and he said, very softly, "Wait, were you the one who—" He stopped. He never finished the sentence. And in that pause, the entire table fell into the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Before I tell you everything that happened that night, I want you to know that this story is not about revenge. It's not about triumph or proving anyone wrong. It's about something quieter than that. Something that most people never get to witness. It's about the moment when the truth finally steps forward all on its own, without anyone pushing it. The venue was a large event hall about 40 minutes outside the city. I arrived a little later than most guests, not intentionally, but because my shift had run long and I'd barely had enough time to change out of my scrubs and drive across town. When I walked through the entrance, the celebration was already in full swing. The ceiling was draped with hanging lights that cast a warm amber glow across the room. Round tables were covered in ivory linen, each one decorated with tall glass vases filled with white and blush flowers. The band near the far wall was playing something slow and elegant, and the room was filled with the hum of conversation, the clinking of champagne flutes, and occasional bursts of laughter rising above everything else. My stepsister Vanessa was at the center of it all, exactly where she had always wanted to be. She was wearing a long white gown with an open back and intricate beading across the shoulders. Her hair was pinned up perfectly. She moved through the crowd like she had choreographed every step, pausing to receive compliments, reaching out to squeeze someone's hand, laughing at exactly the right moments. She was radiant in the way that people who are very comfortable with being watched tend to be. I found a quiet seat toward the end of one of the longer tables near the side of the room. A few distant relatives nodded in my direction as I sat down. One older cousin asked me how work was going. I told her it was good, that I was still at the same hospital, that things were busy, but I loved it. She nodded and then turned back to her own conversation. I was used to that. I had always been easy to overlook at family gatherings. With Vanessa around, most people tended to naturally drift toward whoever was most dazzling in the room. And Vanessa was always that person. Growing up, we hadn't exactly been close. My mother and Vanessa's father had married when I was around 12, and from the outside, it looked like a perfectly blended family. 2 daughters, 1 household, 1 dinner table. But underneath all of that, the experience was quite different depending on which daughter you were. Vanessa had been raised in comfort. Private tutors, summer programs abroad, designer birthday parties. Her father had built a successful real estate business over the years, and she had grown up understanding at a very deep level that appearances mattered, that what you wore and what you drove and who you knew were the metrics by which a person's worth was measured. I had grown up understanding something different. My father had passed away when I was young, and my mother had worked hard to keep us stable. I picked up part-time jobs during high school, worked my way through a nursing program, and came out the other side with a degree, a mountain of student loans, and a deep sense of purpose. I had chosen to work in emergency care because I was drawn to the intensity of it. The moments when everything is on the line and the decisions you make in the next 60 seconds actually matter. Not everyone is built for that kind of pressure. I happened to be. But none of that registered on the surface. To most people at family events, I was simply the quieter one. The stepsister who wore sensible shoes and talked about hospital schedules. The dinner service began around 7:30. Waiters in white shirts moved efficiently between the tables, delivering plates of food and refilling glasses. The energy in the room shifted slightly as people settled in and the focus moved from mingling to eating. The band lowered their volume to something more ambient and conversations became more contained to individual tables. I had just taken my first bite when I heard the sound of glass being tapped lightly with a spoon. The soft ringing cut through the room and people gradually turned their attention toward the main table at the front. Vanessa was on her feet, holding her champagne flute with 2 fingers, beaming at the room. She had something to say. Vanessa always had something to say. I watched as she scanned the room for a moment and then found exactly what she was looking for. Me. Her eyes landed on me and her smile widened in a particular way that I recognized immediately. It was a smile with an agenda. I had seen it 100 times growing up. It appeared before a punchline. It appeared before something that would embarrass me just enough to be entertaining without crossing into anything that could be called cruel. Vanessa had always been very precise about that line. She gestured toward me with her free hand. "Claire," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Come over for a second. I want to introduce you." I set my napkin on the table and stood. There was no graceful way to decline in a room full of people, and I had no desire to cause a scene at her wedding. So I walked toward the main table while the room watched in that way that happens when someone is being called out in a social setting and everyone is waiting to see how it will go. Vanessa placed her hand on my shoulder when I reached her and turned toward the groom's family with a wide, performative smile. "Everyone, this is my stepsister Claire," she announced. Then she paused just long enough to create the kind of anticipatory silence that stand-up comedians use before a punchline. "She works at a hospital," Vanessa continued, and then laughed lightly. "She's just a nurse." A few people around the table chuckled. Not cruelly, not loudly, but enough. Someone murmured something like, "Oh, how sweet." I noticed a couple of the younger women exchange a small look, and I stood there with my shoulders relaxed and a smile on my face that revealed absolutely nothing of what I was actually feeling. Because here is the thing that I've learned over years of working in emergency care. You cannot afford to let your emotions run the room. When someone is in front of you in crisis, when their heart is struggling and their oxygen levels are dropping, the moment you let your fear or your frustration take over is the moment you become less useful to that person. You learn to be steady. You learn to hold things. And that skill, that particular kind of emotional discipline, does not stay at the hospital door when you leave your shift. It becomes part of how you move through the world. So I smiled. I thanked people politely when they nodded at me, and then I returned to my seat. The conversation at the table resumed. The food was good. Someone complimented the flowers. Vanessa launched into a detailed description of the honeymoon she and her new husband Daniel had planned. 2 weeks starting in Portugal, then moving through southern Spain. She described it with the enthusiasm of someone who knew they were being listened to, and people were listening. She had a gift for holding a room. And then I noticed something shift. Across the table, Daniel's father had gone still. He wasn't eating. He wasn't participating in the conversation around him. He was sitting with his fork resting against the edge of his plate, and his eyes were fixed on me. Not rudely, not aggressively, but with a kind of concentrated attention that felt different from casual observation. He was the sort of man who looked like he had spent his life paying close attention to things. Silver-haired, well-dressed, but not flashy, with the calm bearing of someone who had been through enough to stop being rattled by small things. He looked to be in his early 70s. He reminded me of the kind of patient who, even while unwell, manages to stay composed and asks thoughtful questions about what is happening to them. Daniel noticed his father's expression first. He leaned slightly to the side and said something quietly to him. His father gave a small nod but didn't look away from me. Vanessa was still talking about the hotel they had booked in Lisbon. Something about a rooftop terrace and private butler service. A few guests were making appreciative sounds. But the energy on my end of the table had become slightly different. A few people had caught on to the fact that Daniel's father was distracted by something. One woman near him glanced between the older man and me, curious. After another minute, Daniel's father cleared his throat softly. He addressed Daniel in a low voice, but the table had grown quiet enough that several of us heard him. "What did Vanessa say her stepsister's name was?" he asked. Daniel looked toward me. "Claire." Daniel's father repeated it. "Claire." He said it slowly. The way you say a word when you're trying to match it to a face. When you're pulling on a thread somewhere in the back of your mind and hoping it will bring something forward. Vanessa had caught the exchange by now. She waved her hand with a breezy laugh. "Oh, don't mind Claire," she said. "She basically lives at the hospital. She's there more than she's anywhere else." A couple of people smiled at that. But Daniel's father didn't react to it at all. He was still looking at me with that thoughtful, searching expression. After a moment, he leaned slightly forward. "Please forgive me," he said politely, speaking to me directly now. "I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, but I have the very strong feeling that we have met before." I looked at him carefully. My mind was doing the thing it always does when someone says that to me, running quickly through the faces I remember from work. There are thousands of them. Patients and their families. People I have sat beside during frightening nights. People who were brought in and then sent home and then, in all likelihood, moved on and never thought about me again. That's the nature of the job. You give everything you have in a moment that is critical for someone else, and then that moment ends and they return to their life and you return to your next patient. "I may have met you before," I told him honestly. "I work in emergency care and I meet many people, often during very difficult moments. I'm sorry I can't place you immediately." He nodded slowly at that. "That makes sense," he said. He picked up his fork again, but I could see that his attention was still partially somewhere else. He was quiet for a stretch while the conversation around the table gradually picked back up. Vanessa shifted topics. She was talking now about the wedding planning process, how stressful it had been, how the florist had nearly sent the wrong arrangements, and she had caught the error just in time. Daniel was listening with the slightly glazed expression of a man who had heard this particular story several times. A few of the women at the table were nodding sympathetically. But then Daniel's father set his fork down again. He had the look of someone who has just reached the word they've been searching for in the middle of a sentence. It's a very specific expression, and I recognized it immediately. He looked at me again. His voice was steady but quieter than before. "About 3 years ago," he said carefully, "were you working at Mercy General?" The name of the hospital landed in my chest before I even had time to process the words consciously. "Yes," I said. "I worked there for almost 4 years." The older man exhaled slowly. He closed his eyes for just a second. When he opened them again, the searching quality was gone. In its place was something much more settled. He knew exactly where he had seen my face. He turned to Daniel. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it now that made the table go completely quiet. Even Vanessa stopped talking. 3 years ago, he said, I was driving home late one evening when another car ran a red light and struck mine on the driver's side. The impact was significant. By the time the ambulance reached me, I was in serious trouble. There was internal bleeding, several broken ribs, and I had lost consciousness briefly on the way to the hospital. He paused. No one at the table made a sound. When I arrived at the emergency room, he continued, the hospital was operating with limited staff. There had been a large public demonstration near the main roads into the city that evening, and traffic had been impossible. Several physicians were delayed by more than an hour trying to get in. The nurses on duty were managing as best they could in very difficult circumstances. He looked at me steadily. There was one nurse who stayed with me the entire time. She kept monitoring my vitals. She spoke to me consistently, asked me questions, made sure I was responding. She stayed close. She didn't leave my side for a single moment, even when the room was chaotic and there were other demands on her attention. He paused again. Then he said, very simply, that nurse was you. The silence that followed was the kind that settles into a room and changes the temperature of it. I felt the weight of every set of eyes at that table turning toward me all at once. My face stayed calm. My hands were folded in my lap. I do remember that night, I said quietly. It was a very difficult shift. He nodded. For me, he said, it was the night I almost didn't survive. The doctors told me afterward that the critical factor was that my condition had been carefully monitored during the window before they arrived. That the person who stayed with me had kept me stable long enough for the surgical team to intervene. He looked at me for a long moment before he continued. They told me if that hadn't happened, I would very likely not have made it. Daniel had gone very still across the table. His face was doing something complicated, moving between disbelief and gratitude, and a kind of stunned processing that happens when you learn something enormous in a completely unexpected moment. "You saved him," Daniel said. He wasn't asking. I shook my head gently. I did what anyone in my position would have done. I was doing my job. But Daniel's father shook his head firmly at that. He wasn't willing to let me minimize it, and his voice became more deliberate. "No," he said. "What you did goes beyond what the job requires. I have spoken with many doctors and nurses since that night. I know enough now to understand that staying with one patient continuously for that length of time in a department that was stretched as thin as yours was that evening required a specific choice. You chose to stay. That matters." He turned then, slowly and deliberately toward Vanessa. The room held its breath. "You introduced your stepsister tonight," he said, "by telling us she is just a nurse." His voice was not angry. It was measured and even, which somehow made it land more heavily than anger would have. "I want you to understand something. 3 years ago, the woman you described that way kept me alive long enough to see my son get married tonight. Long enough to sit at this table. Long enough to watch this evening happen." He let that settle for a moment. "There is no such thing as just a nurse," he said. "Not when the nurse in question is the reason a person's heart is still beating." Vanessa's face had lost all of its color. The easy confidence she had carried all evening, the way she had moved through the room like she owned it, all of it had drained away in the space of about 30 seconds. She was looking at the table. She said nothing. For the first time in the many years I had known her, she had nothing to fill the silence with. Some of the guests nearby had begun whispering softly to one another. An older woman near the far end of the table was shaking her head slowly. A few people looked genuinely ashamed of having laughed earlier, and their discomfort was visible in the way they shifted in their seats and avoided making eye contact. Daniel stood up. He walked around the table toward me with the deliberate movements of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it. He extended his hand and I shook it. "Thank you," he said. He said it plainly and without ornamentation because sometimes that's the only way to say something that is actually too large for words. "Thank you for what you did for my father. I mean that with everything I have." I nodded. "I was glad he survived," I told him. "That's the honest truth of it. That's why I do the work." Daniel's father stood as well and crossed the few steps between us. He held out his hand and I shook it. His grip was firm and warm. He held it for just a moment longer than a casual handshake, the way people sometimes do when they are trying to communicate something that language doesn't quite reach. The band started up again somewhere behind us, easing the room back into motion. Guests gradually resumed their conversations, though the atmosphere at our table remained quietly different than it had been before. People spoke to me differently for the rest of the evening. They asked about my work with genuine interest rather than polite accommodation. A few came over individually to introduce themselves. One woman told me her daughter was considering nursing school and asked if I had any thoughts on the field. I talked with her for nearly 20 minutes. Vanessa stayed at her table for a long time after that. She wasn't entirely absent from the rest of the evening, eventually standing to cut the cake, eventually sharing a dance with Daniel, eventually managing something resembling her earlier composure. But it was quieter. The easy authority she had commanded over the room all night didn't fully return. Something had shifted in how people were looking at her, and I think she felt it. I stayed until about 10 o'clock. When I left, I said goodbye to a few relatives, thanked the people I had spoken with, and slipped out without drawing any particular attention. The night air outside was cool and still. I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving home, not really thinking about Vanessa, not really thinking about the speech she had made, or the laughter it had generated. I was thinking about that shift 3 years ago, about the roads being blocked and the waiting room being loud, and the particular quality of the silence when you are monitoring someone who is fragile, and you are the only thing standing between them and a very bad outcome. I remembered him. Not his name, not the specific details of who he was in his regular life, but I remembered his face in the way I remember certain patients, The ones who required everything you had. The ones where the hours passed and you didn't notice because your entire focus was on keeping this one person stable for one more minute and then one more after that. I had never known what happened to him after he left the hospital. I never do. That's the nature of emergency work. People arrive broken and frightened, and you give them everything you have, and then they go, and you turn to the next person who needs you. You don't often find out how the story ends. That night I found out, and it mattered in a way that I didn't entirely have the words for. There's something I want to say to anyone reading or listening to this who has ever been in a room where their work was dismissed, where the thing they have dedicated their life to was reduced to a punchline or a throwaway comment or a polite way of saying that they don't measure up to someone else's idea of success. What I want to say is this: the value of what you do does not require a room full of witnesses to become real. It was real the whole time. It existed in every moment you showed up and did the hard thing and stayed when it would have been easier to step away. The audience is irrelevant to the truth of it. I didn't walk into that wedding hoping for recognition. I didn't sit at that table expecting anything to shift. I came to be present at my stepsister's celebration, and I would have gone home at the end of the evening having done exactly that, with nothing resolved or acknowledged, and it would have been fine. I have a life that is full of meaning, and I know what I contribute to the world. That knowledge doesn't depend on anyone else confirming it. But there are nights when the truth walks into the room on its own, when the evidence of who you are and what you've done shows up without being summoned. And on those nights, there is nothing quite like watching the people who underestimated you go completely quiet. There's a lesson in this story that I think about sometimes when I'm between patients, standing in a corridor drinking terrible coffee and gathering myself for the next few hours ahead. It's a simple lesson, not particularly original, but the world keeps needing reminding of it, so here it is again. You cannot judge the weight of a person's life by the surface of it. You cannot measure someone's worth by the simplicity of what they wear or the quietness of how they carry themselves or the straightforwardness of the work they do. The person at the corner table in a plain dress might be the reason someone else is alive. The person who is easy to overlook might be the one who, in a different room and a different moment, made a choice that changed everything. My stepsister learned that on her wedding night, not from me, and not in any way I planned or wanted. But the lesson arrived all the same, in front of everyone who had laughed along with her. And at the end of the evening, I drove home through the quiet streets and I got into bed and I set my alarm for 6:15 because I had an early shift the next morning. People to take care of. A job to show up for. A purpose that had never needed anyone's applause to make it matter. That's what it means to be a nurse. Not glamorous. Not always recognized. Not easy, ever. But real in a way that very few things in this world are truly real. Life and death real. Presence when it counts real. Staying when others cannot real. And I would not trade it for anything.